You are sitting in a conversation that suddenly becomes uncomfortable. Someone asks a question that nobody expected, not because it is offensive, but because it feels strangely simple. If the flood story is meant to describe something that literally happened, how are we supposed to understand everything that follows from it? The room becomes quiet. Nobody immediately reaches for an answer. You notice something inside yourself. It is not certainty. It is not disbelief. It is the strange feeling that some questions make us nervous long before we know whether they have good answers. Most people recognize that feeling. It happens whenever a belief we have carried for years meets a question we never allowed ourselves to explore completely. That moment is not unique to religion. It happens in politics, history, family traditions, and even in the stories we tell ourselves about who we are. The discomfort comes from realizing that understanding is often more fragile than confidence. The flood narrative is one of the most recognizable stories in human civilization. Children know it. Artists have painted it. Writers have referenced it. Believers have found profound meaning in it. Skeptics have raised difficult questions about it. The remarkable thing is not that people disagree. The remarkable thing is that the story continues to provoke both faith and curiosity thousands of years after it was written. That alone makes it worth examining carefully. Before asking whether the story makes sense historically, another question deserves attention. Why do some questions about familiar stories feel almost forbidden? Why does uncertainty itself sometimes feel like betrayal? Many people discover that the hardest battle is not deciding what they believe. The hardest battle is allowing themselves to investigate without already fearing the conclusion. There is a psychological tension that appears whenever identity becomes attached to certainty. If a story has shaped your childhood, your family, your community, or your deepest hopes, questioning part of that story can feel as though you are questioning the people you love. That emotional weight often has nothing to do with evidence. It has everything to do with belonging. Perhaps you have experienced something similar outside religion. Maybe you defended an opinion because changing your mind would have meant admitting years of confidence were misplaced. Maybe you stayed silent because asking the wrong question carried social consequences. Human beings often protect identities before they protect ideas. That tendency is universal. If this question has ever crossed your mind, whether you arrived at a believing conclusion or a skeptical one, share your perspective below. Not because there is a prize for agreement, but because honest conversations often begin where certainty becomes less important than curiosity. Imagine someone reading the flood account for the first time as an adult, without childhood familiarity. They might admire its dramatic structure, its moral themes, and its emotional power. They might also immediately wonder about practical details. How should the enormous diversity of animal life be understood? How would different ecosystems recover? Is the account intended as a literal historical report, a theological narrative, a symbolic story, or something that does not fit neatly into modern categories? Those questions are not necessarily attacks on the story. They arise naturally because modern readers bring different expectations to ancient texts than the original audiences did. Ancient literature often communicated truth through forms that were not written to satisfy contemporary scientific curiosity. Some readers therefore approach the flood as literal history. Others understand it as theological storytelling, expressing themes of justice, mercy, corruption, renewal, and covenant. Still others see it as participating in a broader tradition of ancient Near Eastern flood narratives that explored humanity's relationship with the divine and the consequences of moral collapse. None of those perspectives can simply be dismissed without serious consideration. The more interesting question becomes why different people find different interpretations compelling. Perhaps that tells us something important about ourselves. Human beings rarely seek only facts. We seek meaning. We seek coherence. We seek stories that explain suffering, hope, failure, and redemption. That search for meaning is powerful enough that the same narrative can inspire devotion in one person, skepticism in another, and philosophical reflection in a third. The flood story therefore becomes more than a debate about ancient events. It becomes a mirror reflecting the assumptions we bring to every difficult question. Are we looking for historical precision, moral instruction, spiritual symbolism, cultural history, Psychological insight? Our expectations often shape our conclusions before we even begin reading. That realization can be uncomfortable because it suggests that disagreement is not always caused by intelligence or ignorance. Sometimes it begins with different assumptions about what a text is trying to accomplish. There is another layer that many people overlook. The flood narrative confronts readers with profound questions about justice, responsibility, human violence, and the possibility of renewal after catastrophe. Even readers who interpret the account symbolically often wrestle with those themes. What does it mean for corruption to spread through an entire society? Can civilization reach a point where rebuilding becomes necessary? Why do human beings repeatedly create systems that harm one another despite believing they are progressing? Those questions remain relevant regardless of how one understands the historical dimensions of the story. They invite reflection on the human condition rather than offering easy conclusions. Perhaps that explains why the account has endured. Stories survive across centuries, not only because people agree about them, but because they continue generating questions that each generation must answer for itself. Whether someone ultimately views the flood as literal history, sacred symbolism, theological narrative, or cultural literature, the deeper challenge remains remarkably similar. It asks every reader to examine how they respond when familiar certainty encounters unfamiliar questions. That may be the most unsettling flood of all. The strange thing is that the deeper you look into almost any ancient story, the less it becomes a battle between belief and disbelief, and the more it becomes a mirror reflecting the way the human mind searches for certainty. Think about how quickly people divide themselves into camps. One person insists every detail must describe literal history because otherwise everything collapses. Another insists every difficulty proves the entire narrative must be rejected. Yet both reactions often reveal the same psychological instinct. We are uncomfortable living with unresolved tension. We want the question settled. We want the uncertainty to disappear. We would rather defend a complete answer than patiently examine an incomplete one. That impulse reaches far beyond religion. It appears whenever our identity depends upon feeling intellectually secure. Imagine standing beside someone who has just experienced profound personal loss. Their career has fallen apart. A relationship has ended. Their plans for the future have dissolved almost overnight. In those moments, people rarely ask for scientific explanations first. They ask why. Why now? Why this? Why me? The human mind instinctively transforms suffering into narrative because stories allow pain to become meaningful instead of random. Ancient civilizations were no different. Floods were among the most terrifying disasters imaginable. Entire communities could disappear, crops could vanish, families could lose everything within hours. A flood was more than weather. It represented chaos swallowing order. Whether one approaches the flood narrative as historical, symbolic, theological, or literary, it is difficult to ignore that universal human experience hiding beneath the surface. Every generation has known some version of watching the world they trusted suddenly disappear. Sometimes the flood is water. Sometimes it is war. Sometimes it is disease. Sometimes it is betrayal. Sometimes it is depression that slowly washes away every certainty a person thought they possessed. Perhaps that is why the story continues speaking across cultures and centuries. It is not merely about surviving rising water. It is about surviving the collapse of the world as you knew it. Consider how often people build invisible arcs throughout their lives. Some place all their hope inside financial success. Others trust reputation. Others trust relationships. Others trust intelligence. Others trust religious certainty itself. Every one of us constructs something we believe will carry us safely through whatever disaster arrives. The difficult question is not whether floods exist. They do. The difficult question is whether the vessel we have built can actually survive the storm we imagine it will face. That realization becomes deeply personal, because almost nobody discovers the strength of their foundations until life begins removing everything built upon them. There is another uncomfortable possibility that deserves attention. Perhaps one reason the flood story creates such passionate disagreement is because it forces people to confront different definitions of truth. Modern culture often treats truth as though it must belong entirely to one category. Either something is scientifically measurable or it has no value. Ancient cultures often operated differently. Narratives could communicate moral, existential, and theological truths without functioning according to the expectations of modern historical writing. Recognizing that difference does not automatically answer every question, nor does it require abandoning any particular belief. Instead, it asks whether we are reading an ancient text according to the expectations of its original world or according to the assumptions of our own. That distinction changes the conversation dramatically. It also explains why sincere, intelligent people sometimes reach different conclusions after studying exactly the same material. Their disagreement often begins long before they reach the first sentence. It begins with the lens they bring to the reading itself. Have you ever noticed how rarely people examine their own assumptions with the same intensity they examine everyone else's? We become experts at identifying confirmation bias in those who disagree with us while remaining almost blind to our own. That is one of the mind's most persistent habits. We naturally collect evidence that protects our existing worldview while quietly ignoring evidence that complicates it. This tendency affects believers and skeptics alike because it is part of being human. If you have ever found yourself changing your mind about something you once defended with complete confidence, then you already know how unsettling that process can be. It feels less like learning and more like rebuilding your identity from the ground up. If this tension sounds familiar, whether you think the flood account should be read literally, symbolically, or somewhere in between, write your perspective below. The most interesting conversations are often the ones where people explain not only what they believe, but how they arrived there. Sometimes the journey teaches more than the conclusion itself. Imagine two people leaving the same conversation. One says the story demonstrates divine justice, another says it demonstrates humanity's struggle to explain suffering, a third says it reveals the literary imagination of the ancient world. A fourth says it strengthens their faith because its symbolism points toward renewal after destruction. Which one is obviously incapable of reflection? Perhaps none of them. Perhaps the more meaningful question is whether each person has genuinely wrestled with the strongest arguments available, rather than only the ones that reinforce what they already wanted to believe. Intellectual honesty is often less dramatic than certainty. It asks difficult questions without assuming that every difficult question has an immediate answer. That attitude is surprisingly rare because uncertainty can feel frightening. Certainty offers emotional comfort, even when reality remains complicated. Yet history repeatedly reminds us that confidence and correctness are not always the same thing. The flood story therefore becomes an invitation to examine something larger than itself. It asks how we handle ambiguity. Can we remain curious without becoming cynical? Can we respect belief without abandoning critical thinking? Can we question assumptions without assuming that every tradition is therefore meaningless? Those are not merely religious questions. They are questions about intellectual maturity. As the discussion grows deeper, another realization begins quietly emerging beneath everything else. The real conflict may never have been between faith and reason at all. It may be between humility and certainty. The willingness to admit that human understanding has limits may ultimately prove more valuable than pretending every mystery has already been solved. Whether someone ultimately believes the flood happened exactly as described, understands it through symbolism, or approaches it as an ancient narrative shaped by its historical context, every reader eventually faces the same challenge. What do you do when a story refuses to fit neatly inside the categories you expected? Do you force it into a simple answer, or do you allow it to expand the questions you are willing to ask? That choice may reveal far more about the reader than it does about the story itself. By the time most people realize this, they have stopped arguing only about an ancient flood. They have begun confronting something much closer to home. They have begun confronting the uncomfortable possibility that the greatest flood is not the one described in the narrative, but the one that arrives whenever certainty is overwhelmed by honest inquiry, leaving behind only the difficult, deeply human task of deciding what kind of person we become once the waters finally recede. Eventually, every difficult conversation reaches a point where facts alone are no longer enough. not because facts stop mattering, but because they cannot answer every question the human heart insists on asking. There comes a moment when the discussion is no longer about an ancient flood, an ark, or even the interpretation of an old text. It becomes about you, about the quiet assumptions you carry every day without realizing they are there, about the invisible framework through which you judge what deserves your trust. Perhaps that is why stories like this continue to survive while countless others disappear. They refuse to remain trapped in the past. They continue exposing something timeless about the human condition. Every generation believes it is more informed than the one before it. Every generation also discovers that knowledge does not automatically produce wisdom. We know more about the universe today than any civilization before us, yet anxiety continues to rise. Loneliness continues to spread. People remain divided, fearful, and desperate for meaning. Progress has solved many problems, but it has not eliminated the deeper questions that ancient stories were attempting to confront. Why do human beings repeatedly destroy what they claim to value most? Why does violence return even after promises of peace? Why do societies forget the lessons they once swore they would never repeat? Why do individuals continue making choices they already know will hurt themselves and those around them? Those questions remain astonishingly current. Whether someone reads the flood account as sacred history, symbolic literature, theological reflection, or cultural narrative, those questions continue waiting beneath the surface. They are uncomfortable because they refuse to stay safely inside the pages of an ancient text. They quietly follow us into our homes, our relationships, our politics, our communities, and even our private thoughts. Consider how easily people recognize corruption in others while minimizing it within themselves. Entire civilizations have convinced themselves they were acting for justice while committing extraordinary cruelty. Individuals have done exactly the same thing. The human capacity for self-justification is almost limitless. We possess an extraordinary ability to explain our own actions while condemning identical behavior in someone else. Perhaps that observation is more disturbing than any debate about historical details, because it cannot be dismissed as belonging only to the distant past. It belongs to every generation, including ours. Imagine if the flood narrative were placed before modern readers for the first time, stripped of every tradition, every debate, and every inherited interpretation. What might stand out first? Perhaps not the water. Perhaps not even the ark. Perhaps the overwhelming image would be humanity confronting the consequences of its own moral collapse. Whether interpreted literally or symbolically, that possibility shifts attention away from curiosity about engineering, geography, or biology, and toward an examination of conscience. Suddenly the story begins asking questions that are impossible to outsource to scholars alone. What kind of world are we creating? What habits slowly erode compassion without us noticing? At what point does indifference become normal? How many destructive choices become acceptable, simply because everyone around us is making them too? Those questions demand participation rather than observation. They cannot be answered by winning an argument. They require self-examination. That is often the most difficult kind of reflection because it offers no audience to impress and no opponent to defeat. There is only the uncomfortable conversation between a person and their own conscience. Ironically, many public debates avoid that conversation entirely. It is easier to argue about someone else's interpretation than to examine our own motivations. It is easier to criticize another worldview than to ask why we cling so tightly to our own. Certainty feels safe because it protects identity. Humility feels dangerous because it leaves room for correction. Yet nearly every meaningful form of growth begins exactly there. Growth rarely starts with confidence. It usually begins with the admission that there may be more to understand. That realization applies equally to believers, skeptics, historians, philosophers, and anyone else willing to think honestly. Genuine curiosity does not require abandoning conviction. It requires recognizing that conviction and humility are not enemies. A person can hold deep beliefs while remaining open to learning. Likewise, someone can ask difficult questions without assuming they already possess every answer. Perhaps that balance is far more difficult than choosing a side. It asks us to resist the temptation to reduce complex subjects into simple slogans. It asks us to listen before reacting. It asks us to distinguish between challenging an idea and dismissing the people who hold it. Those habits are becoming increasingly rare in a world that rewards certainty more quickly than understanding. Before this conversation ends, there is one final possibility worth considering. What if the deepest reason stories like the flood continue generating discussion is not because they force us to choose between belief and disbelief, but because they expose our relationship with uncertainty itself? Human beings have always wanted a world where every mystery could be solved and every tension resolved. Reality rarely grants that wish. Some questions remain open, not because they are unimportant, but because they are large enough to accompany humanity across centuries. The flood narrative may be one of those questions. It invites historical investigation, literary analysis, theological reflection, philosophical debate, and psychological insight, yet it refuses to be exhausted by any single approach. That does not mean every interpretation is equally persuasive. It means the conversation is richer than the false choice between absolute certainty and absolute dismissal. Perhaps the most surprising lesson is not found in deciding exactly how the story should be understood. Perhaps it is found in recognizing what the conversation reveals about us. Are we willing to examine our assumptions with the same rigor we apply to those of others? Can we tolerate unanswered questions without rushing toward comforting conclusions? Can we disagree without reducing one another to caricatures? Those challenges may ultimately matter more than the outcome of any single debate, because they shape the kind of people we become. Long after the discussion ends, long after opinions are expressed and arguments exchanged, one question quietly remains. When the waters of certainty begin to rise and familiar answers no longer feel sufficient, what will keep you grounded? Blind confidence can be swept away. Empty cynicism can be swept away as well. What often survives is something quieter and more demanding: the willingness to continue seeking truth with intellectual honesty, compassion for those who disagree, and enough humility to recognize that the search itself may transform us as profoundly as any answer we eventually reach. Perhaps that is why this ancient story still refuses to disappear. Not because everyone agrees about what happened, but because it continues inviting every generation to wrestle with the same enduring questions about justice, meaning, responsibility, hope, and the fragile human desire to understand a world that will always remain, at least in part, deeper than our certainty can fully contain.